If you're a Christian like me, I can say with absolute certainty, your church is teaching you lies, and in 6 minutes, you'll see exactly why. If you spend any time on Christian YouTube, your feed is probably flooded with videos all contradicting each other. Why you need to be Catholic. Eastern Orthodoxy is the only way. And of course, denomination tierless. And this isn't just about different opinions. Scripture warns us that teaching or following false doctrine can literally send you to hell. So how do you know who actually is teaching the truth? Let me give you an analogy that will make things crystal clear. Imagine you have a fight to the death in 6 months. You need to learn martial arts, and you have 2 options. One teacher learned directly from Bruce Lee himself, while the other teacher is just reading Bruce Lee's books 50 years later. Which teacher would know the real Bruce Lee techniques? It's obvious you'd go to the person who learned directly from the source. Only a fool would choose otherwise. Christianity follows this exact pattern, but the stakes are infinitely higher. Now imagine, instead of 6 months, you don't know when this fight will occur. It could be next year, or it could be this afternoon. And that mysterious opponent you're fighting? That's the devil. In our example, Bruce Lee represents the apostles. That first teacher represents the early church fathers, men who learned directly from the apostles themselves. And that second teacher? That's your pastor and denomination. When Jesus taught his apostles, he spent 3 entire years with them, day and night. That's over 12,000 hours of direct teaching. Meanwhile, the entire New Testament takes just 24 hours to read out loud. Let that sink in. 24 hours of written content versus 12,000 hours of direct teaching from Jesus himself. Yet men like Martin Luther, John Calvin, and John Wesley, living 1500 years after the apostles, somehow think they understand Christianity better than those who spent thousands of hours learning directly from the apostles themselves. Let's take the Apostle John, for example, who wrote the Gospel of John, 3 letters of John, and Revelation. Historical documents and letters prove he spent years teaching his best student, Polycarp, everything about Christianity. Polycarp then taught his disciple Irenaeus everything that John had taught him. Much of this teaching was written down and preserved until today. While the Orthodox claim ancient tradition, their luxurious lifestyles and icon veneration were actually condemned by the early church. These Christians weren't like Protestant pastors interpreting scripture 2,000 years later, or Catholic priests following traditions that developed over centuries. They could literally say, I learned this directly from John the Apostle, who learned this directly from Jesus. The early Christians met in homes, shared actual meals together, and everyone participated. There were no massive church buildings, no ostentatious ceremonies, and no passive audiences. When was the last time your whole church sat down and ate a real meal together? These weren't casual believers either. These were people so committed to Jesus' teachings that when Roman soldiers came to kill them, they didn't fight back. They went singing to their deaths, praying for the executioners. Today we have massive church buildings and churches that have launched wars, killing millions in God's name. The same churches claiming apostolic succession, blessed armies, and launched crusades, while the apostles' actual students taught that Christians should never kill. In the early church, you could travel anywhere, from Rome to Jerusalem to Africa, and find the exact same faith being taught, because every church could trace their teaching directly back to Jesus. Irenaeus writes about this, showing how every church taught the same truth because they all got it from the same source. But today we have 40,000 different denominations, each claiming they have the truth. If you moved to a different city back then, you'd find Christians teaching exactly what you learned back home. Try that today and you'll find 50 churches teaching 50 different versions of Christianity. The early Christians would be horrified. They wrote specifically about how there is one faith, one truth, handed down from the apostles themselves, not thousands of different interpretations developed centuries later. Common objections. Let me address what many of you are thinking, because these are the most common arguments that people make. But doctrine develops over time and gets clearer. The early Christians would call this exactly what it is.
Heresy.
Heresy means any deviation from what was taught at the beginning. Tertullian wrote that the first rule of the faith is that it admits to no changes or development. Irenaeus said any doctrine newer than the apostles is automatically false. If the apostles taught the complete truth from Jesus, how could it develop? Truth doesn't evolve, it's preserved. But the church fathers disagreed with each other. When someone says this, I know they've never actually studied the early church fathers. If they had, they would find almost complete agreement on everything important. Their rare disagreements were about minor things, like when to celebrate Easter, where they each pointed to what different apostles taught them. Polycarp would say, John taught us this way, or others would say, Paul taught us that way instead. But on everything that mattered, how to worship, what salvation means, how church should work, who Jesus had, and much, much more, they had complete and utter unity, because these core truths came straight from Jesus himself. But we follow scripture alone. Who gave you the Bible? Who identified which letters were really from Paul? The same early Christians you're ignoring, they knew which books were authentic because they got them directly from the apostles' churches. The churches in Ephesus, Corinth, and Rome had Paul's original letters. The early Christians knew which Gospels were real because they learned from the people who were there. The early church fathers quoted scripture constantly. They didn't just know it, they spoke its original language. When Polycarp taught about Jesus, he quoted the New Testament over 100 times. Clement's letters are practically Bible studies, weaving together scripture after scripture. These men read Paul's letters in their native Greek. Some of them were friends with Paul himself. So when you say scripture alone, what you really mean is my interpretation alone. I know what many of you are feeling right now. It's uncomfortable. You're thinking about your pastor who baptized your children, your church friends you see every Sunday, the worship team you've sung with for years, the Bible study group that supported you through hard times. I get it. It's easier to ignore what you've learned today and keep going to your comfortable church with the people you love. But that's exactly how we got here. Generations of Christians choosing comfort over truth, choosing what's easy over what is right. The early Christians gave their lives for the truth. Are we really going to reject it just to avoid awkward conversations? I've barely touched on the problems with Catholic and Orthodox claims of being the true church. I'll expose those thoroughly in another video coming soon. But here's what you should do right now. Whether you're Protestant, Catholic, or Orthodox, go back to the beginning. Read the writings of the early church fathers yourself. Don't take my word for it. That's exactly how we got into this mess. Blindly trusting what others tell us about Christianity. Read Clement, read Polycarp, Ignatius, the Didache. These aren't hidden documents. They're all available online for free. I'll link them in the description, along with a video going much deeper with more evidence on everything we've covered today. When you read them, you'll see exactly what I've shown you. I didn't discover anything new. This isn't a new denomination, doctrine, or sect. I just believe what the earliest Christians believe and what Jesus taught. And I read their writings and let their words speak for themselves. The truth is right there in front of us. It always has been. We just have to be willing to look. God bless you.